Hello, I'm Haleh Sfandiari, the director of the Middle East program. We are delighted to have with us today the chairman of the board of trustees of the Wilson Center, Ambassador Joseph Gildenhorn, who has been a supporter of the Middle East program ever since he became the chairman of the board, and we always impose on him to come to these meetings. I would like to thank you for joining us today. It's a week before the holidays and you're all very busy, we know, but this is a very interesting and timely meeting. In the last month, we have all been subjected to conflicting reports on the prospects for renewed negotiations between Iran and the P5+1 group on Iran's nuclear program, and even the possibility of one-to-one talks between Iran and the US. Iran has been reported as interested in direct talks with Washington and not interested in direct talks. We learned Iran will only reopen talks with the P5+1 if there is something new on the table and that Iran interlocutors have something new to offer. We also learned that the P5+1 will bring only a moderately enhanced offer of incentives for Iran to the table. Iran, it was reported, was not cooperating with the IAEA, and also that the recent visit of an IAEA team to Iran went well, that another visit is scheduled, and that Iran may even open Parchin military site to the IAEA inspections. To help us understand this game of yes, we will talk, no, we will not talk, yes, there is an important new proposal on the table, no, there is no major new proposal, yes, Iran is softening its position, no, it is not. We have invited 3 top experts in the field to help us unravel this conundrum. Each of our panelists will speak for 10 minutes, and we will then have a discussion between the speakers and with the audience. You have the bios of the speakers, so I will not introduce them. Shaul Bakhash is going to focus on the effect of sanctions and the mindset of Iran's leader, Ayatollah Khamenei, regarding talks and the nuclear agreement. Robert Litwak will discuss the view from Washington of Iran's nuclear program, and Trita Parsi will discuss the nuclear issue as viewed from Tehran. All 3 speakers have authored books on the subject and have written extensively. And I also would like to remind everybody to close their cell phone, because we have live webcasts and we have a lot of people watching this program, not only in the United States, but around the world. So could you please bear with 1 hour of not texting, not reading your messages, and closing your cell phone. And I will appreciate if the speakers also close their cell phone. We have an overflow in the 6th floor. We have had 155 registration for this meeting, so we will take their questions too. Shaul, you can either speak from there or come here. Speak from there, here? Okay. It's up to you.
Thank you, Haleh. I want to touch on 3 topics in my brief remarks. First of all, about the impact of sanctions on Iran. Secondly, signs that the solidarity of the leadership in Iran is cracking. under the impact of these sanctions. And finally, on the mindset of Iran's supreme leader, Khamenei, Iran's, as it were, ultimate decider. And I will conclude that he's not really ready for a big deal on the nuclear issue. First of all, the sanctions. I think by now the signs are everywhere that the sanctions have helped disrupt the Iranian economy. Oil exports are down by half. Iran is having a difficulty repatriating the payments for oil it does sell because of banking sanctions. Iranian importers, manufacturers are having difficulty importing raw materials and machinery parts or paying for the goods they can manage to purchase abroad. There are reports of production lines shut down and a squeeze on the budget. In fact, government officials have been talking about an austerity budget in the new Iranian year beginning in March. And we all heard a couple of months ago about the run on the Iranian currency, the rial, and the drop in the value of the rial against the American dollar. In fact, even at official rates now, the dollar's value has been reduced by 50%, and on the open market, its value has dropped even more steeply. Now, Iranian officials in the last few weeks have been talking much more openly, not only about the possibility, but also the desirability of discussions, reopening discussions on Iran's nuclear program, not only with the P+5, but also about the possibility of direct talks with the United States. And I think the explanation for that, for this change in, or the softening of the Iranian position regarding talks, is clearly the impact of sanctions. And I think these messages we're getting, not necessarily official line, but from top officials, are all the more striking because the leader's position until very recently, even now, has been strongly against direct talks with the United States. Only in September, his principal advisor on foreign affairs was quick to shoot down a suggestion by Iran's president that there should be, that Iran was open to direct talks with the United States. Now, among officials who've been speaking more openly about the desirability of direct negotiations with the US is Iran's president, who has said publicly that the only way to resolve the issues between Iran and not only the EU, but with the United States, is direct talks between Iran and America. Mohammad Javad Larijani, the head of Iran's misnamed Commission for Human Rights and the brother of two of the most important officials in the country, also said recently talks with the United States are not taboo, and that if the interests of the country require it, Iran would negotiate with the United States, even, as he put it, in the depths of hell. The head of Iran's judiciary did not rule out direct talks, although he did say that these talks could not come about overnight, and that the Americans should not expect Iran to pay a ransom when it comes to the negotiating table. I think very interesting has been an analysis of Iran's intelligence ministry that was made public, an analysis examining the possibility of a military attack on Iran's nuclear facilities. This analysis drew a distinction between the position of Israel, which the analysis said wants to see the destruction of all of Iran's nuclear facilities, and President Obama's position, which is one that hopes to resolve the issue through diplomacy and negotiation. The analysis also said that it would be, quote, a grave sin to ignore the possibility of a military attack on Iran, and that diplomacy and negotiation is a low-cost and a much more promising avenue to take. And at least two government spokesmen have recently downplayed the significance of direct talks between the United States, but downplaying them in a way that suggests they that if they take place and take place against what has been Iran's position on direct talks up to now, this is not such a big deal. At least two officials have said that Iran has talked to the United States in the past on specific issues such as Iraq and Afghanistan, and if there are talks, this would be nothing very new. Now, so what we can conclude really is that there is discussion within the ruling elite, among government officials, about the desirability or the necessity of Iran re-engaging with the P+5 and perhaps directly with the United States. And I think what we are noticing is our factions among what we might call the moderates who favor discussions and negotiations, and the hardliners who do not. Both sides are engaged in a war, as it were, for Khamenei's ear, and it is Khamenei, the supreme leader, who really is the ultimate decider in Iran on these major issues. Now, Khamenei has not said much on the nuclear issue or on negotiations in the last month, but in October and November, he remained very defiant on the question of the nuclear issue and Iran's rights to pursue enrichment and its own nuclear program, of course always denying that Iran is seeking a nuclear weapon. And I think there are a whole host of reasons why he is so reluctant to enter into discussions on the nuclear issue, and certainly to enter into negotiations with the United States. I should say parenthetically, I think that most analysts agree that it is not only through negotiations at the P+5 level, but direct negotiations between the United States and Iran that will be required to resolve the issues between the two countries and between Iran and the EU. Now, Khamenei, in his recent statements, has depicted the issue between Iran and the United States not in terms simply of Iran's nuclear program, but in terms of what you might call an epic struggle between Iran's rights to dignity, independence, and to pursue its own path, and a hegemonic power, the United States, that seeks world domination. Secondly, I think Khamenei attaches considerable importance to what he believes is his personal and Iran's high standing on the Arab street, among Muslims and the oppressed everywhere. And he attributes this, what he believes to be this high standing, he attributes it to the forthright stance Iran has taken against the United States. It is the only country, he has repeatedly said, that has refused to bend to American pressure. And he has often equated merely sitting down at the table with the United States as an acknowledgement of weakness, retreat. In addition, I think Khamenei does not trust the United States. They are lying, he said recently, possibly in an indirect response to Secretary of State Clinton's remark that sanctions will be eased if Iran is forthcoming on the nuclear issue. He believes America's ultimate aim is regime change in Iran. And the nuclear issue, he has said, is merely an excuse. What America cannot tolerate is the very existence of the Islamic Republic. Besides, Khamenei cannot see that any good can come out of negotiations between the United States and Iran, believing America will never concede the rights that Iran believes it has in the field of nuclear technology. In addition, it seems to me the example of Saddam Hussein is ever on his mind. He fears that if Iran yields to one set of American demands, others will follow with no end in sight. He also seems to believe that Iran can ride through the present set of sanctions, punishing as they may be, as Iran has navigated more difficult sanctions and difficult periods in the past. Khamenei also has to consider the hardline views of his military commanders. We have all noted in recent weeks the warnings Iran's military commanders have issued regarding the damage they can inflict on the United States and on Israel if Iran is attacked. The commander of Iran's paramilitary Basij forces recently described the United States as the most criminal regime on earth, and said that relations with America would be possible only if the U.S. dissolved the CIA, withdrew its troops from the Persian Gulf, and closed down 50 American military bases abroad. Now, Naqdi, the general, does not, I think, speak for the government or reflect necessarily the official line, but such views are an indication of the obstacle that Khamenei would have to overcome among his own military leaders if he were to agree to anything less than a perfect deal with the United States and the Europeans over its nuclear program. I think we must conclude then that there are those in the leadership who are telling Khamenei and cautiously telling the public that the sanctions are damaging Iran, and direct talks with the P+5, P5+1, and the United States are necessary. But I think we have to add that Khamenei, if he allows his lieutenants to enter into such negotiations, does so with extreme reluctance, skepticism, and wariness. In the same way that the U.S. is demanding from Iran what Iran is not ready to give, Khamenei will need from the United States what it is unrealistic of him to expect. Khamenei will not give up enrichment, surrender its fuel stocks enriched to 20% to the 20% level, allow more intrusive inspections, and close down the Fardo enrichment facility without concessions from the United States that he can represent as a great victory for Iran. And at this point, it seems to me the prospect of the United States meeting these high expectations on Iran's part are very dim. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you, Saud. It was a very optimistic ending. Trita, you have to be more upbeat. Thank you.
Thank you, Hala, for organizing today's event. It's a pleasure to share our platform with Shaul and Trita. President Obama has described Iran as an outlier state, a country that is defying its obligations under the Nuclear Non-Proliferation Treaty. When President Obama used the term, White House officials said it was a calculated departure from the Bush-era moniker of rogue state. Rogue state carried the connotation of a state that was irredeemable, beyond the pale, and that the threat derived from the very character of the rogue states. After 9/11, the rogue state concept was central to the Bush administration's case for a preventive war of regime change in Iraq. The Iraq precedent was coercive non-proliferation through a change of regime. A Bush administration official described Iraq as a type. But 8 months later, in December 2003, an alternative precedent was set with the Libya deal. A verifiable WMD disarmament. Non-proliferation was achieved through a change within a regime rather than through a change of regime. What sealed the deal with Libya was a tacit but clear security assurance that if Gaddafi gave up his weapons of mass destruction, that the United States would fall off of the objective of regime change. Now, in the aftermath of those two precedents in dealing with Iran, the Bush administration was caught between those precedents and sent a consistently mixed message. It wasn't clear whether the U.S. objective was to change the Iranian regime or to change its conduct, its behavior. It couldn't replicate Iraq, and it was unwilling to offer the security assurance that had been central to the Libyan deal. Now, Obama came to office, having controversially campaigned on a platform of engaging rogue states, and he recast the challenge posed by Iran by framing it not in terms of a unilateral American concept of rogue state, but rather in terms of Tehran's behavior, its noncompliance with established international norms. President Obama offered a structured choice to the Tehran regime: abide by international norms and thereby gain the economic benefits of greater integration into the international community, or remain in non-compliance and thereby face international isolation and punitive consequences. He clarified and ended the mixed message of the Bush administration, in essence offering Iran the full Libya deal with the security assurance. But the ability of the administration to offer Iran the type of security assurance that had been central to Gaddafi's decision to give up his WMD programs was undercut by Libya's NATO intervention in 2011, even though it was done as under a rubric of humanitarian intervention. Tehran seized on it as evidence that Gaddafi had been duped into dismantling his programs. The supreme leader declared that US-assisted regime change in Libya had validated Iran's decision not to, quote, retreat, but to increase its nuclear facilities year after year, close quote. With its regime takedowns in Iraq and Libya, Washington has essentially priced itself out of the security assurance market in Tehran. All options for dealing with Iran may remain on the table, but none is good. The all options on the table formulation is usually a reference to the possibility of a military strike on Iran's nuclear program. That openly debated option would be the most telegraph punch in history at this point. And it runs up against major liabilities. First, it would at best set back but not end the program. Second, a limited attack on Iran's nuclear sites could well escalate into a regional conflict, as a CENTCOM study recently predicted. In essence, a decision to attack Iran's nuclear infrastructure because of this escalatory potential is a decision to launch a preventive war, and one should be under no illusion. And third, the case for a military strike on Iran's nuclear program rests on an assessment of the theocratic regime as undeterrable and apocalyptic. But a military strike could well generate a nationalist backlash within Iran with a perverse consequence of bolstering the clerical regime. So the crux of the problem is viewed as the regime, as sort of the rationale for urgent military action, but such action would bolster and leave the regime in power. But the depiction of Iran as an irrational state runs contrary to US national intelligence estimates that have characterized the clerical regime's decision-making as being, quote, guided by a cost-benefit approach, close quote. The Obama administration has downplayed the military option, instead pushing for tough economic sanctions to affect Iranian decision-making. The president has described the sanctions imposed by the United States and the EU as crippling and said that they have had the effect of, quote, virtually grinding the Iranian economy to a halt, close quote. Iran's ability to enrich uranium gives it an inherent hedge option for a nuclear weapon. But U.S. intelligence analysts maintain that Iran has not yet decided to cross the threshold from a potential capability to an actual weapon. Indeed, the strategic ambiguity of a hedge might well serve Iranian interests. Former President Rafsanjani famously said in 2005, quote, "As long as we can enrich uranium and master the nuclear fuel cycle, we don't need anything else," close quote. Iran's program is determined and incremental, but it's not a crash program to get a weapon as quickly as possible. This hedge status might well be Iran's strategic sweet spot. With Iran under the pressure of sanctions, President Obama observed the Tehran regime has the opportunity to make a quote-unquote strategic calculation that at least defers this decision to weaponize. But critics of the administration assert that given the character of the Iranian regime, allowing Iran to retain even a latent capability to acquire nuclear weapons because of its mastery of the nuclear fuel cycle, that latent capability constitutes an unacceptable threat. And that is the crux of the dispute between the United States and Israel. Yet the hard reality is that the window in which a full rollback of Iran's capabilities was possible has closed. And with that objective no longer attainable, Washington has pragmatically pursued diplomacy, pursued by the coercive pressure of sanctions, to curb Iran's acquisition of additional fissile material. The objective is reportedly to limit uranium enrichment to the pilot site at Natanz under IAEA close surveillance to prevent cheating in return for sanctions relief. In the meantime, President Obama has declared, quote, "I do not have a policy of containment. I have a policy to prevent Iran from obtaining a nuclear weapon," close quote. By drawing this red line, preventing weaponization, the President has signaled that the United States will not launch a preventive war to deny Iran any nuclear hedge option. His disavowal of containment is a reflection of the meaning the term has taken on in the contemporary debate, that is, acquiescing to Iran's acquisition of nuclear weapons and then deterring their use through the retaliatory threat of U.S. nuclear weapons. That connotation is an unfortunate departure from diplomat George Kennan's original concept of containment, that it was to keep regimes in check until they collapse to their own internal weaknesses. The Obama administration has offered Iran a stark choice: integration or isolation. And therein lies the dilemma, which Shaul touched upon. Iran perceives the very process of integration into an international community whose dominant power is the United States as an insidious threat to regime survival. Integration offers economic benefits to sustain the regime, but it also carries the risk of political contagion that could destabilize it. What this unresolved dilemma means is critical to assessing whether a nuclear deal is possible. The nuclear issue is a proxy for the more fundamental foreign policy debate in Tehran over what type of a relationship Iran is prepared to have with the United States and the rest of the world. That strategic choice turns on a persisting question in Tehran, as Henry Kissinger put it. Is the Islamic Republic a revolutionary state or an ordinary country? Hala began today's program by alluding to the reports of a new P5+1 offer to bound the Iranian nuclear program. Again, Iran will be offered a structured choice. And in the reports of this new P5+1 initiative, an Obama administration official was quoted as saying, "We want to see if the Iranian regime is in a position to make a deal or if it's even capable of making a deal," close quote. Given the proxy status of the nuclear issue, proxy for this broader question of Iran's relationship with the outside world, that remains an open question, but one that should again be put to the test through diplomatic engagement. But if engagement falters and the military option is constrained in the ways I alluded to, what then? Although Iran's mastery of the nuclear fuel cycle creates an inherent option for a bomb, the Tehran regime has no urgent incentive to weaponize. Current U.S. policy, emphasizing coercive sanctions and diplomatic isolation to compel Iran to come into compliance with its obligations under the NPT, would fall squarely under the rubric of containment. And yet, the term has been eschewed and is being delegitimized in the U.S. policy debate. As long as Iran does not overtly cross the U.S. red line of weaponization, U.S. policy will likely remain containment in form, if not in name. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Trita, you can, sure. Let's go.
Thank you so much, Al. It's great being back here, great being on the same panel with respected friends and colleagues. I think there were a lot of very interesting concepts that were put out there, and I think it's fascinating to see what a mirror image the conversation in Iran is compared to the United States. The very same question marks that exist here. Is Iran capable of making that choice? Is Iran interested? Does it really imagine itself being able to come to terms with the United States? Are the same questions that are being asked over there. Is America capable of delivering on the choice that it says that it is presenting Iran? Is America capable of living within Iran under its current political structure? Is the United States really ready for all of this? It's very fascinating to see the mirror image that exists between the two. And another mirror image is the political constraints that exist on both sides. And I've spoken about that at this very forum before, so I won't go into deeper details about that. But I think it is worth mentioning that this is the time, this is the moment, not to look for political solutions that are politically feasible. Because what is politically feasible is something that is constructed to retain the status quo. This is the time to look at what is, this is the time to redefine what is politically feasible. If that is not done in both Tehran and in Washington, I have a hard time seeing that the very significant gap that exists, at least the significant gap as it is perceived by the two parties, is going to be very difficult to be overcome. Now, as Shaul mentioned, there's a very interesting conversation and debate going on. Some of it is far more open now than it has been in before, in regards to whether the Iranians should be talking to the US and if it's the time and the moment and the right circumstances. I think one thing that may have been missed a little bit, that it's not just a conversation as to whether Iran should sit down and talk to the United States, because that's happened before. Already in January 2009, Khamenei gave a talk in which he said that he's never been against actual negotiations with the United States as long as it would serve Iran's national interest, and positioning himself as the person who would determine when the time has come to claim that it is now in Iran's national interest to do so. In February 2009, the Iranians were in the same room with Bill Burns at a P5+1 meeting. Bill Burns, however, was not authorized to speak at the meeting, but they were all in the same room in the same meeting. In October 2009, there was not only Bill Burns and a strong team of American negotiators in the room, they were leading the negotiations, and then there was a bilateral for about 45 minutes between Bill Burns, Jalili from the Iranian side, and a few other people. Later on, October 2009 in Vienna, there were also bilaterals, although El-Baradei was in the room at that moment. So these things have taken place in the past. That's not the big hurdle that the Iranians are talking about. The hurdle that they're talking about right now in Tehran is, should there be a bilateral with the United States for the purpose of establishing a relationship? Establishing a relationship. And that's a big jump from what's happened in the past. That is a previous conversation, whether it's a taboo to talk to the US or not, and that's been broken. Now it's whether they should talk to the US in order to establish a relationship, which essentially means finally doing what has scared them in the past, as well as scared the others, is to actually resolve this issue in a more permanent way. In order for that to happen, though, the Iranians will have to accept a bilateral with the United States, and I think it's going to be very interesting to see whether at the next meeting or if there is time for additional meetings before the Iranian New Year, the Iranians will come and they will agree to do a bilateral with the United States. Even if it's only a 15-minute conversation about the weather, it would still be a tremendously valuable signal, because it would signal Obama that the Iranians are taking steps that they in the past have not dared to take in order to resolve this. And that hopefully will give him the courage to take the steps that the United States so far have not dared to take when it comes to resolving this issue. And I think the president is looking for a sign that would give him the impression that it's worthwhile spending political capital on this issue. Clearly, if there is no willingness from the Iranian side to sit down in a bilateral, the incentives for the president to really double down on diplomacy, really take political risk, really take on Congress on this issue will not be as significant as they should be. Now, the Iranians themselves oftentimes like to complain that the P5+1 structure is incapable of fully producing the type of results that are needed. All the offers so far have the sign of anything that has been constructed or produced by committee. And you know that expression. It's far from perfect. It's following the lowest common denominator. In order to really get to a solution, the Iranians recognize that bilateral is needing. At least implicitly they do so by complaining about how bad the P5 is. Now is the time for them to redefine what is politically feasible and come to the table and agree to a bilateral within the period of now till the beginning, to the mid-March level. Now, what is it that the Iranians want? The Iranians want a couple of things. Some of them perhaps a little bit easier, perhaps a little bit tougher for some of the others. They want some sanctions relief that is proportionate to the concessions that they would be given. And of course, the definition of proportionate is something that the negotiators will have to hash out and come to some form of a consensus. They want an acceptance that Iran will have enrichment on its soil in a limited fashion at the end of the negotiation process. This is what oftentimes is called that Iran wants the West to recognize that Iran has a right to enrichment. In practical terms, it means that the end solution would be one in which the Iranians have not permanently suspended enrichment. They can have enrichment as long, of course, that it is limited under inspections and limited in the sense that its percentage level is not above 5%. And something that they don't dare to say publicly because of the political landscape that they have over there, they want a more ongoing conversation with the United States for the simple purpose of trying to figure out what is it that the United States is up to, what it is that it is thinking. Right now, the Iranians don't have access to that. If they're going to pay the political price of negotiating, that is something that they want to have access to so they don't have to pay that price every time they need to have a conversation with the United States. Now, what are the fears that they have in all of this? Well, they're very similar to the fears that exist on this side. There is a question of what is the intent, and I think Shaul explained it very well. There is a very strong perception that ultimately the United States wants to see regime change. And whether the tool is war, sanctions, containment, or even dialogue, the objective remains the same. The US is just trying to find alternative ways of achieving that same objective of regime change. But then there's also a second question, which is, what is the capability of the United States? One of the fears that the Iranians have right now is if they agree to concessions that are going to be costly for them domestically at home, is the United States capable of reciprocating and giving concessions of some form of a proportionate dimension that is valuable to the Iranians? And then it particularly comes down to the sanctions issue. Is the United States capable of lifting the sanctions that it has imposed on Iran, which it also says has been very effective in getting Iran to the table? If the Iranians agree to the various proposals, will there be any sanctions relief? Now, up until this moment, sanctions relief has not been on the table. In the packages that were presented in Istanbul, Baghdad, and Moscow, the US made it very clear sanctions relief is not on the table. Now, there may be a situation in which some things were discussed privately that was not discussed publicly about what else could be in the package. It's an interesting situation in which both sides seem to, rather than to publicly glorify the packages that they were putting on the table, they're publicly de-glorifying the packages that they're putting on the table in order to minimize the political costs at home that they would have to pay for offering something that actually is of value to the other side. Now, so far, the suggestions have been that the sanctions that would be easiest to lift are the European sanctions. And that is true, because the European sanctions go through the foreign ministries, and as a result, they don't require the involvement of parliaments or a more difficult procedures to get them lifted. But it's also sending a signal, which is essentially saying it's really difficult to lift American sanctions. And if we have a step-by-step process, reciprocal, and both sides want to know, is there some form of agreement of what the end state is? They also want to know, does the other side have the capability of delivering the last step? The last step from our end, I assume, is that the Iranians will have to accept to live with the United States in the region. The Iranians will have to accept to implement the additional protocol. and many of the other limitations on its nuclear program. The last step that the Iranians are very keen to know is, will all the nuclear relevant sanctions be lifted, mindful of the fact that they go through Congress? So far, the president's track record on dealing with Congress on the issue of Iran has not been particularly impressive. He lost a 94-0 vote just 2 weeks ago, lost a 100-0 vote late December 2009. And mindful of the fact of the difficulty we see that the president is having on the fiscal cliff, and then he's only opposed by the Republicans, you can imagine some of the difficulties that then will exist when the president is pushing Congress on sanctions relief with Iran, mindful of the fact that he will not just be facing the Republicans, but also a large chunk of the Democrats on that issue. These are the question marks that exist on the other side, which is, if they take the first step, start taking the risk, and even if the US and the EU start taking some of those steps, at the end of the day, is the other side intent and capable on delivering on all of these different things? And we can talk about this enough until everyone is paralyzed by fear. And so far, that seems to have been happening on both sides. But again, I go back to what I said earlier on. This is the moment to redefine what is politically feasible, because if this is not done, then we're going to end up in a situation in which the choices will be much more stark and gloomy than the ones that we already have. If I could just say one last thing, if I have a couple of minutes, on the issue of sanctions. Because there's and I think Shaul also mentioned he believes that sanctions have been very effective in bringing the Iranians to this point. And that may not be true. I think we won't know for certain until we actually have negotiations and see if the Iranians on the issue, on the substance of the issues, have a different position. But also then, I think we also have to ask ourselves, even if that was the case, and that's a big if still, was it necessary? Was it necessary to go down this route in order to actually be able to get an agreement? I'm of the view that it actually wasn't. There has been opportunities that both sides have missed on numerous occasions. Both sides, I want to emphasize. For instance, I think the Iranians did a significant mistake in not agreeing to the proposal that was put in front of them in October 2009, and I think they regret it themselves, seeing what has happened since then. The US missed an opportunity in 2010 when the Turks and the Brazilians managed to get a deal that was built on the American benchmarks, built on the letter that President of the United States sent him only 3 weeks before he went to Tehran. It was actually very interesting because in one of my interviews with the EU diplomat about this issue, one of the things that the US and the EU said caused the Brazilian-Turkish deal not to be sufficient was that the deal did not address that Iran had started enriching uranium at the 20% level. And technically, that's quite correct. Iran had done so, but the negotiations between Turkey and Brazil did not reach an agreement on that point. At the same time, it was not mentioned in Obama's letter that it would be an important thing. I asked, hypothetically, one of the European diplomats who's deeply involved in this, what if the Iranians had agreed to this? What would have happened then? And his immediate response was, perhaps he didn't self-censor, he said, then we would have been in trouble. Which was very interesting. Why would we have been in trouble if the Iranians actually had done exactly what we wanted? Goes back to the point I'm trying to make here. I don't think this level of sanctions that is strangulating the entire economy and destroying Iran's civil society, combined with the efforts of the regime itself, is necessary to get to this point. But it is necessary if we want to achieve another thing, which is to make sure that the deal comes along with some degree of humiliation or perception of humiliation in order to ensure that at the end of the day, this is going to be perceived as a deal in which the United States and the West and the P5+1 as one was in overwhelming strength and Iran had to succumb to it. And the reason why this is important for those who are pursuing this line, I think, is ultimately, as was mentioned earlier by Rob, Iran has been a revolutionary state, and it is still not completely clear whether he wants to cease being a revolutionary state or not. Being a revolutionary state in that region means that Iran has significantly and consistently challenged the American order in the region, and has been quite open about the fact that it wants to replace it. I'm not really sure what they want to replace it with, but the challenge to the American order in the region has been consistent in Iranian policies and rhetoric since 1979. If a deal were to be struck, which it could have been, without that degree of humiliation, then there would also have been at least a partial success for Iran in challenging the American order in the region. But if you do have that level of punishment, then I think the calculation is that Iran will not be able to declare that victory, that deal, as a partial victory even, but it will essentially have been put back into its place. And the order and structure in the region would remain unchallenged, at least perceivably, for some time in the future. Thank you.
Thank you. We had 3 very interesting presentations, and I'd like to open the floor to your questions. Can I ask questions, please? Amal, please. Just wait for the mic, please. Thank you.
Amal Mudallali with the Wilson Center. I just want to start with the last point that Mr. Parsi has talked about the order in the region. The Iranians made it clear many times that they would like to have the discussion include their role in the region and their strategic interest as part of the package. Do you think the Iranians will accept to talk only about their nuclear program as in negotiations, and do you think the United States is ready to talk to Iran about a whole package of its interest and strategic interest in the region and role in the whole region?
I'm left with the impression I think the United States would be willing to talk to Iran about a whole set of different issues, but in a bilateral channel, not at the P5 level. And I think there's some obvious reasons for that. It would be very difficult to carry on that conversation at the P5 level, particularly mindful of the fact that it's very important for the United States, and correctly so, in keeping unity within the P5 vis-a-vis Iran. If you open up the issue to other issues such as Syria, etc., you don't have that P5 unity. In fact, you have clear divisions that then the Iranians could take advantage of in order to weaken the P5's united position on the nuclear issue. Secondly, I sincerely hope, that the United States have clear plans that in a bilateral also address the issue of human rights in Iran. And that's a conversation that is best had when the Russians and the Chinese are not in the room. So I think there are some incentives for the Iranians to go to the bilateral channel, because they do have a clear interest and desire to talk about Syria, talk about other things in the region, including their own role. And the place to do so is in the bilateral.
Rob, you want to add something to the United States?
On the regional role? Well,
Yeah.
I mean, the context is shifting with the Arab awakening. I mean, the sectarian schism has reemerged in the region, and I think that's, many of the countries where there have been changes of regimes, are now viewing kind of the regional politics. Iraq is probably the most important example where, the sectarian dimension is sort of, central to the politics there. So I think there'd be a lot of debate on kind of what that role would constitute and what would constitute a legitimate interest. But I think that the nuclear negotiation would open the door on sort of a broader discussion about the U.S.-Iranian relationship. And my sense is, that the issue of normalization of relations with the United States is sort of central to the politics, the elan of the revolution. I mean, it dominates Iran in a way that Iran does not dominate the United States. I mean, there was some poll that Iranians were asked, I don't know this validity. It's sort of, if true, fascinating. They asked, how many hours a day does the President of the United States think about Iran? And they said, about 3-4 hours a day. It's the defining issue in Iran. It is not the defining issue in the United States, and it's not central. But
Michelle?
I think it's very important to the Iranians that they be recognized by the United States as a power in the Persian Gulf and the Middle East region, with a right to a seat at the table when regional issues are being discussed. On the other hand, I don't think on this particular occasion Khamenei has given the green light for a broad discussion with the United States. I think if there are discussions, they'll be limited to the nuclear issue.
Okay. Yes, please. And then Henry. Yes. Just wait.
Milton Honig, International Center for Terrorism Studies. Little mention has been made about the IAEA's questions about the possible military dimensions of Iran's nuclear program, and how that will play into a, say, negotiation either with the P5+1 or the U.S. in making some kind of final agreement, except Trita mentioned that part of this agreement would be signing the additional protocol, but that seems to get you back to where you were. At the moment, Iran is reluctant to answer the questions of the IEA about its past nuclear program. But with the additional protocol in place, this opens up Iran for a wide range of inspections that actually occurred for a couple of years, like between 2003 and 2005. So aren't we back to where we were with the signing with the additional protocol in place?
Rita, you want to go first?
Yeah, in many ways we would be back to where we were, and that tells you how far we have gone on a trip that no one really can say that they're benefiting particularly from. Both the West and Iran are in many ways in a worse position. They both think that they're in a stronger position. The Iranians think that they are in a stronger position because they've advanced enrichment. They have more facts on the ground. They have 7,000 something kilos of LEU. They only had 1,200 in October 2009, 2,400 in May 2010. And getting back to a moment in which they're implementing the additional protocol would bring us back to 2003, 2005. But it is nevertheless a very important step forward. Answering the question about the past activities, I think also is necessary, because I think it's going to be very difficult to create that degree of confidence in the international community if those questions are not answered. I would guess, though, that the Iranians are going to ask that whatever they were to reveal about that, since they seized it in 2003, they would not be punished for it. And there's been proposals that have been circulating in Washington that essentially some sort of a truth commission. They won't be punished as long as they come true and show exactly what they have done. But these are the things that will happen only at the very, very end of a negotiation. I don't see that taking place at any of the early or even mid-degree levels of the talks.
Joe, did you have a question? Yes.
My question involves Israel and where they fit in the scheme of things. Does the threat of a military strike pressure Iran into negotiations? Is there a great concern in Iran about Israel, and where does where does it all stand at this time?
Shaul, you want to take this?
Well, it's an interesting question. I think the answer is we don't know. Iran's military commanders have responded to these threats of attack by Israel with, as you would expect, with bravado and threats that Israel will be wiped out if it attacks Iran. On the other hand, the analysis by the Ministry of Intelligence I cited earlier suggests that there is concern, and that Iran should not lightly dismiss the possibility of a military attack. But I would say the sanctions have been more effective in bringing Iran to the table this time than the threat of a military attack.
Does anyone want to add something very briefly, because we have a lot of questions?
Just very briefly, I would say I agree with Shaul that at least publicly they have not shown much concern about that, and I think it goes a little bit deeper as well. I don't think the Intelligence Ministry report would state what it stated unless some of that bravado didn't have deeper meaning for them. I don't think they've taken Israel particularly seriously, mindful of the fact that Israel has put forward numerous red lines and the Iranians have walked through all of them, and we've not seen any military action from Israel so far. So the credibility of that has lost. They are much more concerned, of course, about an American military attack. I think they take that they see that very differently. If there is an Israeli military attack, and if the American predictions of what it could or couldn't do turns out to be true, which is that it would have a very limited impact on the nuclear program, setting it back perhaps only a year or so, then there is also a scenario in which the Iranians might try to take advantage of that by not retaliating directly militarily and not enlarging the fight, but playing the victim card, going to the Security Council, either threatening or withdrawing from the NPT, which would be a disastrous move because we would lose all of the inspections that currently are giving us a lot of information on what's taking place there, and also dismantling the sanctions regime. Part of the reason why the U.S. succeeded in getting these very strangulating sanctions on Iran is because of a lot of arms twisting, but also because of the argument that if we don't do this, Israel might attack. Well, if Israel already has attacked, why should several countries continue to commit economic harakiri by continuing to implement these sanctions? In fact, the Iranians may be able to get rid of these sanctions much quicker in that scenario than in a negotiated settlement.
Rob, you wanted to.
The issue of military action is a controversial one in Israel, and many sort of military analysts there feel that the window of Israel's ability to strike is really closed. I would just go back to a point sort of I made in my presentation, which is kind of what's driving the call for military action, which would at best delay the program, not end it, is a sense of the character of the regime. And yet such a strike would leave the regime kind of in place. A military strike would be, has inherent kind of escalatory possibilities, and I think those who argue for military action should, as it were, kind of own it and just say what we're really talking about is launching a preventive war against Iran. That's what it's about.
We had months ago at this forum the former head of Mossad, Halevi, here, and Joe, you were present, and he said that no country, including Iran, is an existential threat to Israel. That was picked up in Iran, so therefore, and the way they twisted it was that we are so strong, so therefore we are not an existential threat to Iran. Henry, and then Barbara. Here, please. Yes.
I'm Henry Precht, and I wanted also to talk about Israel, but Israel in Washington. Does any member of the panel believe that American policy towards Iran on the nuclear issue would change without a change in policy in Jerusalem? And supposing that President Obama was looking for a way to ameliorate our relationship with Iran, how would he go about neutralizing or turning back the Israeli position, which is so strong in the American Congress?
Let's start. Rob, you want to start?
I can't really speak
you?
to the Israeli, issue and its politics. I think there is a kind of an autonomous basis of American policy based on kind of U.S. national interests, and President Obama kind of has articulated that, and there are differences that have emerged over with the Israelis that were evident during the AIPAC meeting, where the president set sort of the American red line on weaponization versus sort of some type of denial of Iran of a latent capability. But I think the crux is on security assurances. The United States can offer adversarial proliferators, if I can put it that way, a security assurance of non-intervention and non-attack. That was what was done in Libya in 2003. But what it can't offer, and the North Koreans have asked about this, is can you offer another type of security assurance which would insulate the regime from the consequences of its integration into the international society? And the United States neither can nor should offer that kind of security assurance to any of the countries we're negotiating with.
Rita, briefly.
Just briefly say, I think Israel has succeeded in making the cost of any shift in policy tremendously high. I don't think, however, that it is so high that there can't be a shift if there is a perception that an acceptable deal can be found. And again, I think that's where, if the Iranians agree to a bilateral, the two sides can essentially boost each other's political courage and political capital to start going down a path that both of them have been somewhat afraid of doing because of the high political cost at home. There needs to be that confidence on both sides that the other side is ready and capable of walking all of the distance. And I think if the Iranians show that, I wouldn't be surprised if the president would take steps and take fights that he so far has handled differently.
So you want to? Barbara?
Barbara Slavin from the Atlantic Council. Trita, I want to talk to you a little bit more about what the U.S. can do on the sanctions front. It's been pretty much recognized that if there were progress, the Europeans would move first. It's easier for them. But if they were to do things like start buying Iranian oil again, that would necessitate some changes in U.S. law as well. So do you have any kind of roadmap as to what the Obama administration could do via executive order, or what kind of legislative action it would have to take to make sanctions relief real? Thanks.
My understanding, based on conversations with folks at Treasury, is that if the Europeans were to lift the sanctions, the OFAC could actually issue a license right away and ensure that those transactions would not be sanctioned. But there's a challenge to that nevertheless. And the challenge there is, A, how many banks are willing to engage in those transactions? Because even if it is permissible, part of the reason why the sanctions regime has been successful in getting so many banks to agree to it is not because necessarily just the law. It's because of the name, what's the word here? The reputational value there. And even if there is an OFAC license, it's not clear that many banks would do so, particularly mindful of the very hefty fines that have been paid and the reputational loss that is now taking place for HSBC, Standard of Britain. They're paying a very heavy price, not only monetarily, but also reputation-wise. We saw that with the exemptions that was made for humanitarian aid to be sent to the earthquake victims in Iran earlier in August. We found no banks that were willing to process the payments, even though they were permissible.
I'm taking two questions from the overflow. Rob, what do you believe is the likelihood that President Obama will choose to spend his political capital on this issue in his second term, especially given the myriad of domestic issues on his desk?
Well, I think that they're, from the accounts in the papers, gearing up for another round of negotiations and an updated offer to Tehran, which might offer the possibility of some type of conditional, a structured agreement where there would be reciprocal steps as Iran came into compliance with its NBT obligations, that there could be some sanctions relief along the way. And I think if one sees sort of a change in Iranian conduct, then it may be easier for President Obama to bring Congress along,
Okay.
where their role is necessary.
Okay. Another question. What would be the downside of President Obama phoning President Ahmadinejad for private, unofficial discussion? Shall?
Well, let's say immediately that President Ahmadinejad would like nothing more. And he has I think, a rather naive idea of how easy it would be to solve these issues between Iran and the United States if he could just get together with President Obama, not only solve Iran-US issues, but all international issues.
Gun laws in the U.S. as well.
But clearly the likelihood is very small.
Yeah. Okay, I have a question to all three panelists. There are going to be presidential elections in June in Iran. I mean, why this rush from the Iranian side to at least have a preliminary meeting with the P5+1? They could have dragged it out till after the holiday, the New Year's holiday here, the Iranian New Year holiday, and then the Iranian will have had an election, and they could have seen who the next president is and then start from the beginning once again. So why this rush? Isn't it the sign that the sanctions are really having an impact? I mean, we all have different sources, and not sources, but talk to people in Iran. And what I hear is that the sanctions are felt really through the society. I mean, regardless of whether you are rich, middle class, or poor. And I think these reports are given to Ayatollah Khamenei, who finally decided, okay, if you people think, which I don't think Khamenei, that it might lead to something, go and talk to these people. Shall?
Yeah, I don't think
go down the line.
Iran's coming presidential elections are a factor, because it's Khamenei who will make the ultimate decision, not the current president or the future one. Now, on the question of sanctions, I already said I think they're really hurting the Iranian economy. Now, whether the leader realizes how deeply they're hurting Iran is another question. I think we know from other cases, autocracies and dictatorships care much less and much more less easily influenced by public opinion than our democracies. But with Iran, I think there are two qualifying factors. One is that people are still freer to express their views and opinion than is the case in a totalitarian state, and I think this discontent will filter to the leadership. And secondly, much more important, is the merchant community, the bazaar, as we say, writ broadly. That is, the merchants, the shopkeepers, the bazaar traders, the importers, the exporters. If they begin to feel the pinch, and if there is a danger that the government would lose their support, then the government would be really in serious danger. And it seems to me if we begin to see if you want, a transfer of loyalties by the bazaar, which has done very well under this regime, and an expression of discontent, that too brings a very important pressure on the government.
Trita?
I could add, sir. I think there's many different factors here that need to be taken into consideration. First of all, once you have the elections, it's not clear, and I don't think it's clear in Khamenei's mind, whether the elections will go as they did last time, which means that there would be several months of political infighting, massive human rights abuses, and a significant weakening of the political elite as a whole. But even if the elections go in a different way, as it did in 2005 or 2001, you also then have a new president who's going to put in a new team, who's going to do a lot of different things, and most importantly, he's going to redefine the president's position vis-a-vis the supreme leader. Right now, before the elections, that dynamic has already been defined. Ahmadinejad is extremely weak internally, and vis-a-vis the president, Khamenei is probably in the strongest position now than he has ever been, and certainly after the elections, because there will be a new president, and that new president is not going to start acting like a lame duck. All presidents so far have challenged the institutional barriers between the president and Khamenei. So this may be a very opportune time for Khamenei to take the big risks that he has to take in order to get an agreement, without having to deal with a very, very messy political situation that Iran is under even normal circumstances. And there's another factor. Sanctions, without a doubt, have been devastating on the economy. But as Shaul said, that is not necessarily a clear indication that they will cave, because they're not a democracy. If Iran was a democracy, we would have seen massive protests for a very long period of time, starting with the ending the subsidy reform, as they did a couple of years ago. But there's two other things that are very important. A, the perception on the Iranian side, already after the central bank sanctions, was that the US and Iran are already at war. We have reached the end of the really effective sanctions that can be imposed, and everything after the central bank sanctions has just been fine-tuning it a little bit, which means that the US doesn't have much more time on its policy before it reaches the choices that Rob mentioned earlier on. And that's a very scary scenario for them, mindful of the fact that at the end of the day, I think they do fear war, particularly if a war in which the US actually has the liberty of being able to use its military force in the manner that it could prior to 2003 and once it may be leaving Afghanistan. I think these are very important factors. I don't think one should discount the effect of sanctions, but I think also we should be very careful not to be too much in love with our own instruments here, because it may surprise us. It surprised the US in May 2012 of this year, when they saw that the Iranians were not caving in after the central bank sanctions had been imposed, and after it was only weeks left, months left before the European oil embargo was going to go into effect. And we didn't see a substantial change in the Iranian position. What the sanctions have managed to do, to a large extent, is to create a game changer in which the time perception has changed, in the sense that prior to this, Iran really thought time was on its side. Now I don't think they do so to the same extent. But every time we've seen a game changer, the game changers so far have failed to lead to a resolution. It's only fueled the other side's desire to find a new game changer. And I think that's what they're doing right now.
So do you want to
I think
add?
2 points. One is, I think Trita is right, that every president so far has set his own agenda vis-a-vis the leader, even though we say he's the ultimate decider. It's been really quite striking that each president has been able to set his own agenda. But I think precisely for that reason, and having rigged elections once, Khamenei is going to make sure the next president is not an independent personality, but his own instrument. Secondly, I think Khamenei may seriously misjudge the ability of Iran to live through these sanctions, and the moment will come when he'll have to negotiate from a much weaker position than he can now.
Rob, you want to add something?
Well, just a phrase that comes to mind that I heard, that Iran does not succumb to pressure, but without pressure will not respond.
Yeah. So, thank you very much. Thank you to the panelists. We opened up the questions for you, and we will have a series of meetings in the new year in this issue. The first one after the first preliminary talk, if they talk, and then we will take it from there. Please join me in thanking them. And